Hello everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Dayton Sports Huddle The Dish. We're here at Submarine House in Centerville, which will be the ongoing host once a week of the show. And I'm here with my co-host and colleague, Richie Moody. And we're honored to have Coach Jim Brown with he's had a storied career at Belmont High School, Wright State, UD, and we have a lot of great things to talk about high school and college sports. And I know, Richie, you have a background with Coach Brown from your time when you came back to Wright State.
Yeah, when I got done with pro baseball, one of the first classes I took with him was basketball theory, and he just informed us that he's still teaching that class out there. So it was great to see him and learn more about how to not only coach basketball, but it's applicable into other sports as well. And it was a great honor to take his class, but also even a great honor now to hear some of the stories and more about how his life shaped him and what he's doing now as well.
Yeah, and I know you had a really good story written about you and another coach by the legendary Tom Archdeacon in the Dayton Daily News, which detailed your career. And I think it was Dave Brittingham.
Yes, it was. He's an assistant softball coach at Wright State. And we had both just gone on the honor flight, which takes veterans to Washington, D.C.
And that's something we'll touch on, your service in Vietnam. But maybe we can just start from the beginning because it's such a fascinating story. You played basketball at Belmont High School when they were a powerhouse, and you played with Don May and Bill Hoskett, who ended up playing in the NBA, I believe, right?
Yes, they did. It's really interesting because, Bill and Don, they were both sophomores when I was a senior, and we had a good basketball team, but we were a ways away from being really good. And I tell people the year after I graduated from Belmont, they won the state championship. The year after I graduated from the University of Dayton, they made it to the Final Four. So my parents screwed up. They had me too early. But anyway, Donnie and Bill were sophomores when I was a senior on that team. John Ross was our coach. And the thing about those two guys, coming into high school at Belmont, everybody knew about Bill Hoskett. His dad was an All-American at Ohio State. Bill had a storied history coming to Donnie May was kind of like he had gone to a Catholic school. Nobody really knew about Donnie May at Belmont. Anyway, they come and Donnie, Bill made the varsity right away. So he was on the varsity, and I think it was like our third game, somebody got hurt, and Coach Ross brought Don up from the JV team. He had 15 rebounds in the first game. He never saw another minute of the JV team. But I tell people, you could talk to Donnie for an hour and a half, and you would never know he played basketball. That's the way he is. He's very humble. Not that Bill isn't, but you could talk to Bill for 5 minutes and you know he was a basketball player. They're both genuine people, and they were great players. They were both drafted by the New York Knicks, both won a world championship, played for Phil Jackson. I think Bill went on and played in the Olympics. Two great, and arguably Donnie might have been the best player that ever played at Dayton, and of course Bill was one of the greatest rebounders in Ohio State's history. So it was that's something I had an opportunity to play with those two guys, and they have had great careers.
Well, one of the reasons why we're doing this is a lot of people don't realize the storied history of sports around the Dayton area, and one of the reasons why Jeff and I wanted to start this talk show was to bring not only ex-professionals, ex-coaches, current coaches, young kids that are going through the recruiting process right now, but Don and Bill, obviously, a lot of younger people probably don't remember them, but we remember them because we're kind of in that middle-aged era. But what was it about, back then in the Dayton area that helped propel the young athletes to become successful, from around where you were at in Belmont?
It was so different back then, Richie. There were 10 high schools. A lot of them didn't have their own gyms, so we played games at the old Fairgrounds Coliseum, which is kind of unique because the Fairgrounds Coliseum is where we at Wright State started because we didn't have a gym. So that's where we played a lot of our practices. We didn't play any games there, but we practiced there a lot. But the Coliseum was like the Palestra of Dayton. I mean, you had Friday night triple headers. I mean, Belmont would play somebody, Roosevelt would play. There were 10 high schools, and the right now in today's, the basketball's kind of gone outside the city, like Centerville's good, Springboro's good, Springfield's good. Back then, all the good basketball players were in the city. I mean, they were at one of those 10 high schools. Now, Fairmont had its share, but there was no Centerville, there was no those were real small schools at that time. But it was. I tell the story because this is hard to believe, but it's true. We played down at the Fairgrounds Coliseum. There was one shower. One shower. The game ended. Both teams went to the same shower room. How would that fly today? Yeah. No. It was. I'm blessed to have played in that kind of environment. It was so cool. High school basketball in Dayton was so different than it is today, and it was really, to be able to grow up in that environment was super.
Well, and you mentioned that that's where Wright State kind of started as well. You obviously coached at Wright State. Tell us a little bit about some of your memorable moments there as well.
Well, you mentioned that I was in Vietnam. I took ROTC in college, and when I went to the University of Dayton, it was a requirement. You didn't have any choice. You had to take ROTC your first 2 years. And after your first 2 years, if you got invited, then you could go on and take it for the next 2 years, which I did. So when I graduated, I became an officer in the Army. Well, I was sent to Vietnam, and I was toward the end of my tour. I had about 2 months left, maybe a month and a half, and I got a letter from John Ross, my high school coach. And he had just been hired as Wright State's first basketball coach. They were going to start a basketball program from scratch, and he wanted to know when I got home if I would be his assistant coach. And, back then, you wrote a letter, it took a week to get home. I mean, there was no cell phone service or anything like that, Skype. So it took a while, but I agreed to do it. And the interesting thing is I got home on February 10th in 1970 from Vietnam. February 12th, I was at a high school basketball game recruiting Jimmy Minch, who came to Wright State as one of our first scholarship players. So it's interesting.
That's amazing. And was the phys ed building there yet?
No, we had our tryouts. This is another interesting story. What you're dealing with at that time is we were starting from scratch. We had no place to play. We had no practice facility on campus. So we practiced at Stebbins High School, usually around 9 o'clock at night. Sometimes we went to a little middle school over on Woodman Drive called Spinning Hills. It's still there, brand new school now. But an interesting story is we were having tryouts, and we had about 70 kids there. And John says to me, he says, go down and talk to that young man down there, find out a little bit more information about him, because we did nothing about anybody. I mean, these kids tried out. And he says, he looks like somebody we might want to keep, but I don't know anything about him. So I went down, I introduced myself, and I said, where'd you go to high school, and so on. And so I said, well, how many hours are you taking? And he said, well, Coach, really, I haven't enrolled yet. I was going to wait to see if I made the team. And Wright State had been in session about 10 weeks. So that's sort of what we were dealing with. I mean, no, we practiced anywhere we could, but most of the time, like Stebbins had their own basketball program, so we had to go at 9 o'clock, and then we practiced at the Fairgrounds Coliseum. It wasn't until 1973, Jeff, that we built the PE building, and that was a godsend. That really propelled our program because we didn't have to travel to practice.
Well, because obviously Wright State, if you look at the timeline, they really ascended quickly to, I know Division I was there in the athletic department when they went to Division I. That was 1990, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I think actually we went Division I in maybe 87. We built the Nutter Center in 90. The Nutter Center opened up in 90, but I think our first year of Division I, it was like 87. The most amazing thing to me about the rise of our basketball program at Wright State, and I think maybe one of the things I'm the most proud of, is the fact that we went from nothing in 13 years won a national championship. And there's programs around the country that have been in existence for years and haven't won a national championship. And here's the thing about our national championship. We didn't play a home game. Like a lot of Division II and Division III tournaments, you play home games. You host games. We didn't host one game. We had to go to Kentucky Wesleyan. We had to go to Bloomsburg State. And then the team we beat in the national championship game had 2 first-round draft choices. They had Earl Jones and I can't think. Earl Jones was a 7-foot player, was drafted by the Los Angeles Lakers, and we beat him by 19 points. So, I mean, the rise of our program was phenomenal, and of course, Coach Underhill had a whole lot to do with that.
Sure. I was going to back you up. You mentioned that You went to ROTC with Vietnam. You had an interesting story about your dad and some basketball too.
Yeah, well, see, growing up, I was a huge UD fan. I mean, I lived and died Flyer basketball. My dad and I my dad was a coach for a while, and every time UD would play, he'd handwrite out a score sheet. He'd write the names on it, and we'd keep score. And so when I went to Vietnam, I was still a fan. I mean, I was a huge fan. And of course, Wright State wasn't, I didn't know anything about Wright State. It hadn't even started yet and my dad would go to the game. He'd sit up in the 400 section where my seats were and take his little transistor radio and tape the game and make a little comments, and then he'd send it to me. And the ironic thing is, when I got the tape about a week later, I didn't know what to do. I had no idea who had won the game. So it was fun. I'd sit in my bunker. I'd listen to the games. I lived in a little hooch with 3 other officers. They thought I was nuts. They thought, what are you doing, Jim? I'm listening to a game. But that's how much of a fan I was. I was a huge, huge UD basketball fan.
And then I guess that would make it extra special for, at the time, what was it, 86 or 87, the first time Wright State played UD?
First time we played them. And this is, I have a lot of respect for 2 guys that coached. Darrell Hedrick down at Miami, because Darrell Hedrick, when we were Division II, Darrell Hedrick bought his team. He was the head coach at Miami University. He brought his team to the PE building. How many guys would do that? And you can't even get some of these coaches today to play anybody on the road. Darrell brought his Division I team to Wright State and played us as a Division II team. And then, of course, Coach Donaher, he told us, when you guys go Division I, we'll play you. And he kept his promise. We played them. They beat us pretty good. It was on a Saturday afternoon. I think we lost by 23, 24 points. But it was great because it gave us exposure. But you mentioned, one of the greatest days of my life was that December 6th of 1990, and we beat them there. We got down 13-1. The place was going nuts. We started 3 freshmen, and those kids came back and won that game going away. So that really gave us a lot of credibility.
And that was, I believe,
Sean Hammonds. Bill was a freshman. Sean Hammonds was a freshman. We had Mark Woods on that team, Marcus Mumphrey, Jeff Underfirth. It was a good team. It was a really good team. And the thing of it is that I remember, I told you we got behind 13-1, and the place was just going nuts. I mean, you've been in UD Arena. It's a tough, tough place to play. And we called timeout. And I looked at our players. I looked in their eyes, and there was no nervousness. You could just see they were mad. They were just upset themselves for getting themselves in this hole. And I remember when we sat back down, I turned to Coach Underhill, and I said, if we can get this thing down to 6 or 8, we got a shot here. Well, we tied it at halftime, and then of course we were up 16 points late in the game, and ended up being a 3-point game. But I mean, it was a phenomenal, and that was a good UD team. That team went to the tournament, went to the NCAA tournament, and won 2 games. So we didn't, it wasn't one of their poorer teams that we beat. We beat a good team.
Yeah, Bill created a definite mismatch for anyone. As I had to guard him at Brookville one year, I'm all of 6'1", and Bill was, 6'8", obviously a little skinnier as a 17, 18-year-old kid, but I'm sure he filled out into college and, obviously created mismatches for else.
Richie, he was a unique player because he was 6'8", and he could go inside. He knew how to post people up, but he also could go out and hit a jump shot, and he could put it on. Just a unique skill set that he had. His son, the youngest son, the one that just got drafted, is a lot like him. His oldest son, the one that went to Penn State, Miami, was a different type of player, but his youngest son, Vince, was a lot like Bill. I mean, just very similar skill set.
And playing for the Houston Rockets. Yeah, going up and down between the G League and the Rockets.
He goes up and down. Yeah.
But yeah, we were talking about the ascension of Wright State, and that day, I remember, because I was sports editor of the Wright State paper at the time, and I remember talking to Dave Dinn, who had played in that first game. He was one of the players left over from the first time they played UD, and I remember him. You remember how quiet of a guy he was. But I remember him saying that after the game in the locker room during interviews, he said the first time that UD played them, that the players were laughing and saying, "You don't belong on the court," typical trash talk. And then so it was extra satisfaction for that group, or the players that were still left, to win that and be part of Wright State really establishing itself as a Division I program.
Right, and I think our players on that team understood the significance of us beating UD. You know, a lot of times you recruit players and they come into your program from around the country and they don't fully appreciate rivalries. They don't appreciate what a certain victory means. And I think those guys that you're talking about, Dave Dent, Scott Penton, that have been there, they appreciated that. They knew what it was. Now the freshmen, I'm not so sure. You know, like Bill Edwards and Sean Hammonds, I'm not sure how much, but those guys really appreciated it because they had been in school 3 years and they've heard all the stuff about UD's this, UD's that, UD, and we're like the little stepchild on the side. And that night we weren't the stepchild anymore.
Yeah, it definitely gave you a lot of credence, and in this area, it really put Wright State as a whole athletic department on the map as well. Obviously, the basketball being the shining star at that point, but I remember even though I wasn't around the area when that happened, boom, it was awesome. Put you guys on the map.
It did a lot for the university. I mean, going Division I. The crowds that we had in the PE building, which was a whole different atmosphere, that propelled us to build the Nutter Center. And I'll say this, when we made the move from Division II to Division I, our program was ready to do that. We had the type of players, we had the facility to do it, and so we were ready to make that move.
And obviously, with Wright State, Ralph Underhill being the integral person who built it. What could you say about that? Because you spent how many years with Coach
18
Underhill?
years. Well, see, when Coach Underhill came to Wright State, our program was kind of in disarray. And Ralph had just won a national championship as an assistant coach at the University of Chattanooga. And I'll never forget our first conversation. He came up for his press conference, and I had spoken to Ralph maybe once or twice on the phone, never met him in person. And we go to the press conference, and after the press conference is over, he says, "Come on, Jim, we're going to lunch." Okay, this will be good. So we go to lunch, and the first thing he says to me, he says, "Jim, we're going to do this together." And I mean, you couldn't have had a better person to work with. I never felt like I was working for Coach Underhill. I was working with him. And Ralph was, I think, in a lot of ways misunderstood by a lot of people. A lot of people say he had a long afro, and he talked a good story. He didn't come in and promise a national championship, but he promised we're going to press from the beginning, we're going to win games. But he was as down-to-earth a person as I've ever met, and we had a tremendous relationship. How many guys stay with a coach for 18 years? I mean, I had chances to leave, but I was having so much fun, and I could tell, and he gave me so much responsibility. I felt like I was a co-head coach with him, and we just had a lot of success, and it was every day going to work was a lot of fun to work with him because he was such a pleasant person to deal with and talk with, and he was a great recruiter. Assistant coaches do a lot of recruiting, and so when he came there, right away he was very involved because that was his background. But as time wore on, he turned it over to me. But he was a tremendous finisher. If I brought a recruit to him, he finished it, boy. He was really good at finishing the deal and getting the kid to sign.
Yeah, and I would echo that sentiment. My brother went to school out there during the beginning of all of that, and I felt like my brother, listening to my brother's stories, he knew Ralph because he was very personable on campus as well. Wow. And, the stories that he would tell me about just running into him and talking to him and then talking to the players as well. So it's not just lip service, it's actually what actions did he bring to it, and you got to live it.
Yeah, he was, one of the things as a coach that, not all players are going to like you, but you want them to respect you. And Ralph, he had a lot of respect, and he was extremely successful. 356 wins in 18 seasons. I mean, that speaks volumes. I mean, we had seasons, probably the best team we ever had. They were 28-3. We got beat the first game of the tournament. I mean, we got upset. We were number one the entire season, got upset. It's hard to win a national championship. I mean, I get a kick out of everybody thinks Alabama's going to just blow right through football thing. Hey, it's not easy. They may do it, but it's not easy. And to have gone through that experience as a coach is one of the highlights of my life, to have experienced the thrill of that.
Because the hard work in the process.
Yeah, and the other thing is the difference between winning and being second is like light years. Yeah. It's like light years, and we had one opportunity and we won that game. So it was a fantastic accomplishment.
Then you had a great experience with obviously winning the Division II national championship, then eventually go on Division I, and then Wright State joins the Mid-Continent Conference, and you mentioned before the show we were talking about it, with 1993, the first March Madness appearance.
Yeah, it was the first time we got to the NCAA tournament. You know, when we went Division I, we couldn't get in the league. So we had some really good seasons. I mean, we had the best record of all the independents in the country there for a while, but we didn't even get a smell to go to the NIT, and it was so frustrating because, you couldn't, when you first start out like that, it's hard to get anybody to play you. But finally we got in the league, and it was Bill Edwards and Sean Hammonds, Mike Nahar's senior year, Mark Woods. It was a great team, and the problem with it was great to go, but we had to play Indiana, who was the number 1 ranked team in the country, and we had to play them virtually on their home floor. And here's the thing about, here was a program, Wright State, never been to the NCAA tournament. We didn't get any kind of respect. We were a 16th seed. We probably should have been like a 14 seed, but because we had never been there before, you're the little guy on the, and so here we are, we go play Indiana. Now the one thing our guys will never ever forget, they played in front of 44,000 people. There were 38,000 people at our practice. I mean, we practiced the day before the game, right after Indiana. And because Indiana practiced right before us, there were 38,000 people watching practice. They all stayed and booed us.
Was that at the RCA Dome? Is that
at the RCA Dome? Yeah, Hoosier Dome then it was called. Yeah.
And with Coach Knight was
Coach
still
Knight,
there.
yeah. It was, and they had Damon Bailey, Calbert Cheney. It was one of the great teams. They didn't win the national championship because Alan Henderson got hurt late in the season, but it was a great team. I think they got beat in the regional championship game, but I mean that was a great experience for our players. I mean, anytime you do something like that, even though it turned out to be kind of a tough night, it was a great experience, something they'll never forget.
And then I know that obviously Wright State, you were there for 18 years, and then
20. I was with Ralph for 18. I was actually at the university for 27 years as a coach.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you got a chance to coach for one season.
Yeah, I was a head coach one season. Yeah, it was a difficult time. Coach Underhill was falsely arrested. It cost him his job. It just wasn't a good situation, and we probably played the toughest schedule in the history of the program. We played Kentucky, we played Louisville, we played 5 Mid-American schools, we played Dayton. It was a very difficult schedule, and we had scheduled it because we had Vitaly Potapenko coming back for his senior year. Well, it's a long story, but when all this stuff happened, Vitaly decided to put his name in the draft. So here we are. I'm the head coach. I start 3 freshmen, a sophomore and a junior. Our first game is at Kentucky. It was a tough year.
And without Vitaly.
Yeah, without Vitaly. He was gone. He was in Cleveland making a lot of money. And it was a very unfortunate situation. Now, I had some great players on that team, and they battled and they played hard, and we lost. When you have freshmen, you're going to lose close games. They were good players, but we lost 10 games by 7 points or less. We just couldn't get over the hump.
That experience.
But it was just a tough year, and but anyway, that you got to deal with what you got to do. That's one of the things you got to do as a coach. You can't quit. You just got to do with what you got to do and make the best of it, and that's what we try to do.
Sure, and then you transitioned into high school then, and how long did you coach at?
Well, that was an interesting thing. I figured University of Wright State had to pay me another year because of my contract, so I really didn't have a job. Jack Butler, who was an assistant with me, was a longtime coach at UD with Coach Donaher. He and I were on this. I was the head coach. Jack was my assistant, and they had to pay both of us for a period of time there. So we were virtually in like a little closet with nothing to do. And he lived out in Englewood, and he was telling me about the Northmont job, the high school job there being open. He's, Jim, you'd be great for that job. And I said, Jack, I don't think so. I don't think I want to do that. But he kept pestering me, and so finally one day I said, okay, I'm going to apply. So I sent a letter, and they called me, and they said, Jim, we kind of heard you were interested, but we've hired somebody. And I said, hey, that's fine. Okay, no problem. So it was July sometime, and the phone at the house rang. And I had never even told my wife about this, So the phone, and my wife says, it's Robin Spiller. Who's that? And I said, well, somebody. So anyway, what had happened was the coach that they had hired had quit, and she wanted to know if I was still interested. And I had gone to college. I had played basketball with Gene Klaus. Gene was a UD player. He was the principal at Northmont. And she says, Gene would just like to talk to you. So I went out, and he talked me into doing it. And I was actually there 16 years. And it was really good for me because, you know, when I was the head coach at Wright State, we won 7 games. And in the back of my mind, I thought, you know, you can do this. You can do it, but there's doubts, you know, because you didn't do it, because I had all those young kids. And so when I went to Northmont had won 4 games the year before. They had never, ever, back all in 40 years of basketball, had more than 3 consecutive winning seasons. That's how, yeah. And it took us a while, but my last 14 years, I was there 16 years. My last 14 years, we had winning seasons every year. It was good for me because I proved to myself, look, you can take a program, you can develop it, and it's harder in high school than it is in college. In college, you can recruit. In high school, you're stuck with what you get, and so it's harder. And it was good for me. It really, you know, I really valued my time at North. I had some great players and some great coaches that I worked with, so it was fun.
And then from Northmont, you transitioned again to
the dark side, as Tom Archdeacon says. Tom Archdeacon, you talked about. He says, Jim, you're on the dark side now. You're with the media. Yeah, I'm now the color analyst with Chris Collins for the Wright State Raiders, and it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and obviously Wright State goes to the NCAA tournament last year under Coach
Scott Nagy. Yeah, Scott Nagy.
And this year looks to be a really exciting season, full of possibilities for the Horizon League going back.
Yeah, they're going to contend. There's no question about that. It's a one-bid league, so you know those 3 games at the end of those 3 days at the end of the season, those are the most important in your life, and so who knows what'll happen. But they have the talent. They're very well coached. They got a great coaching staff. I love their assistant coaches, and so they got a shot. They really have a shot.
How do you enjoy the announcing part of it?
Oh, I love it, because win or lose, I can go have a beer, Richie, and not worry about it. I mean, and the other thing, you can appreciate this. When you've been in coaching as long as I have, you develop a relationship with players, and I have a good relationship with these kids now that are on. I don't coach them, but you know, I interview a lot of them after the game. We have a coaches show on Monday nights where we interview players, and it just keeps me involved with the program that I have so much invested in. You know, I
get to kind of be like that grandfather.
Yeah.
With the you know, you get to send the kids home and move on.
Yeah, it is. It's good to still be involved, and as I said, I really like this coaching staff. I think they're going to do a lot of good things for Wright State.
Well, our producer Anastasia is telling us it's time to wrap up. So, Coach Brown, we really appreciate you being on, and perhaps you could come back towards the NCAA tournament time.
Sure.
And maybe talk about what's been done and what's ahead for Wright State.
Well, I'd be happy to. I really enjoyed it, and good luck with this venture for you guys. It's something I think it's needed, and you know you can bring a lot of good guests on here. So
yeah, I appreciate it. I think I had a couple more questions too that I wanted to get to and talk about. So definitely,
I'll be happy to come back.
And for being on the Dayton Sports Huddle, Coach Brown, you'll get a gift card from the Submarine House. Each guest of our show will be graced with a gift card, and we love this place. I know this is a place we like to hang out, and we're here in Washington Township. And be sure to see the Dayton Sports Huddle on Facebook, and pretty soon we'll have a website up, and also our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again.